Hello and welcome to another episode of Behind the Cloud. Today we're going to be looking at Dataform again. Specifically this time we're going to be exploring releases and scheduling. So releases and scheduling are where you take versions of your code base that you will have sitting up in GitHub in your production or your development branch, and you take snapshots and schedule those to be run on a daily, hourly, monthly basis, however long you want to be scheduling your code for. We'll also talk about how you can run different versions of your code, like a development and production version, and schedule backfills and things like that. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll find it really simple to be able to go away and release and schedule versions of your code and start building out tables and models with Dataform. So to look at releases and scheduling, you can just go to your main repository within Dataform, and you'll see the same four menus we always see: development workspaces, where we have our development workspaces, workflow executions that have run, and then releases and scheduling, which we've yet to look at so far. Within releases and scheduling, you've got two main menus: release configurations and workflow configurations. Release configurations can be thought of as taking a snapshot of the code base from a specific branch within GitHub, whereas workflow configurations are more like scheduling those snapshots of code from your GitHub repositories. So we've got a production one already made here. This will, on a hourly basis, go to the main branch within our GitHub repository, get a copy of that or a snapshot of that code base, and then once a day at 7 a.m, this production runs that code base. It's just a way of being able to move code around, push things up, and making sure you've got the latest version of the code available to be run against. Some of this language and some of the way they describe these things, like release configurations and workflow configurations, are a bit hard to grasp and a bit opaque. They could do a bit of a better job of explaining exactly what these things are. In the interest of trying to explain it a little bit more, let's go through setting one up. So release configuration, let's create one. First and foremost, what's this release ID going to be called? We've already got production, so let's call this one dev. So this is going to be a snapshot of our dev code base from GitHub. Git commit is essentially the branch within GitHub. So again, dev, you could obviously point this at your main branch. Maybe you've got a branch off of dev that you've been working on various features, so you could set up a trigger onto that separate branch as well. The schedule frequency is how often a snapshot of that code base is taken. So like I said, you can do this on an hourly basis, you can do this on a daily, on a weekly, on a monthly, on a custom frequency if you wished. You could also just run it on demand, and maybe that's better here because we're setting up a dev run. We don't necessarily need to be taking snapshots every hour of this, so we could just come in whenever we need to run dev and have a new set of test data pulled out of our model. We can just run this on demand. Compilation overrides are exactly like they are with your main container within the settings. These are just overriding things like the cloud project or the schema suffix or the table prefix to differentiate them from other tables and schemas that you may be running from a production basis. So for example, you may have a Dataform dataset that all your production data is running into, and for your dev purposes, you might just have a schema suffix of dev, so that anything you run from the dev branch will go into Dataform_dev, rather than messing around or potentially overriding your production data, which would obviously be a big problem. We want to keep a firewall between production and development wherever possible. Equally, some people will have an entire Google Cloud project dedicated to development and an entire Google Cloud project dedicated to production. So you could also go that way around and separate those things out in that way. You may also have multiple people within the same organization, within the same repo, multiple analysts who all have their own branches. So you can have a Matthew branch or a Clive branch, and we could have our workspace names prefix to the tables, so any tables we output, if we were working on the same table, a prefix of our names to keep those separate and stop us stepping on each other's toes. I think for our instance, just dev is going to be fine. Really important you pay attention here and put a suffix in if it's needed, because if you don't and you run this, it could inadvertently overwrite your production data, which would obviously not be brilliant. We also have these compilation variables. So these, like I said, this is getting a snapshot of code, and what you can do at time of creating that snapshot is insert a number of variables that are then used within the Dataform model to to manipulate runs or to have specific variables that are used within that model. So one example could be that you have a series of like start dates. We could say like we're going to start 6 days ago, as an example. Within our workflow config, within our workflow settings.yaml, we'd have a var. Let's go and just quickly show you this. Just an example, I've jumped into a test repo here. Let's just go into this branch. You can see here we've got a workflow settings.yaml, and then inside of that workflow settings.yaml, we've got this variables where we can have whatever we want, and we can use these variables throughout the rest of our code base. So we could have a function somewhere that's converting 7 days to today minus 7 days and creating a date out of it, and that date could be being used as a filter on various tables. So you get the idea. You could have as many of these different variables in here as you wish. So just to jump back over to our branch, what you can do at time of running this is you can have specific compilation variables. So I could have start date, and maybe in my default workflow settings.yaml it's 7 days, but I want to run a big old backfill, so I'm going to change this to 30. Now when it takes a snapshot of this code, it's going to override any of those variables that match this key within our workflow settings.yaml, and that snapshot will have our 30-day variable in it instead of 7, and thus anywhere in the code that affects will be affected. So you can create multiple versions of the same code base, but with passing in different variables. Equally, you could potentially be passing in table names and have very uniform models that you can apply in multiple different places and pass in different table names via variables. So you could just take different snapshots of the same code base with a different table name, and fundamentally it outputs different data because it's coming off different tables. So this can be quite powerful once you start to think about the ways in which you could use it. This essentially is a way of us getting a snapshot of our code within our development branch and passing in any dynamic variables that we want to affect our model. So if I came in here, I could grab a new compilation. So I could grab a new snapshot of the code base right there and then, which you would see displayed down here. And that would allow me to then start an execution because I've just gone and got a fresh copy of it. Equally, you can see production is running on an hour by hour basis. So we can see that each hour it's grabbing a new version of that code base. So we can be pretty confident that we got the up-to-date code base and just run our pipeline if we needed to on demand, or we can get a new compilation like so. And we'll see here that the manual update of the compilation is sitting at the bottom there. We can see all the settings for our production run here. So we've not got any compilation overrides, etc. So that's a snapshot of a code, but equally we can also set up a workflow configuration, which, like I said, is a schedule. You create a configuration ID, so let's just call this function manual, and you select a release configuration. You select essentially a snapshot of the code that we've just created above. So in this case, let's just stick with production. As long as your service account has access to all the things it needs to have access to, you can leave this blank and it will use the service account that's attached to your Dataform project. Let's make this one on demand. And then this is where you can select specific actions, specific tags, or all actions. Where this can get really useful is maybe you've got multiple dashboards and you want to separate out the running of all those dashboards. You could do that via tags. So you could have multiple different workflow configurations that are running different dashboards from a release configuration. Or alternatively, you could have daily, weekly, monthly tags for different tables and models that need to run at different frequencies. In which case you could select a daily tag from your tags, and then that would select all of the tables and models that are marked up as daily. And then you could do the same for weekly, and then you could schedule them on that basis. So for anything that's tagged as daily, I can run on a daily basis. Anything that's tagged as weekly, I can run on a weekly basis. So this is just a way of beginning to be able to pull apart your overall repo, to be able to schedule things and break them apart and make sure that everything doesn't have to run all at once. It can run based on how often you want it to. You can also specify selected actions and run selected actions in specific tables if you only want to run these things and not necessarily tag it. And you can decide if that is going to just run that one action, or if it will run anything downstream also, or anything upstream also, by using include dependencies or include dependents. And then finally, you can do a full refresh of the table. If you've made changes to the schema, for example, or anything significant to the table, and you need to drop that table and recreate it, you can click full refresh and it will rebuild that table from scratch when this is enabled. So it may be that you could just have sitting here a workflow configuration that is a full refresh just in case you ever do any large updates and changes. So in a nutshell, that is releases and scheduling. You create a release configuration that is a snapshot of your code base, passing in any dynamic variables that you want to pass in. You update that either manually or on a regular basis, like hourly, weekly, or monthly. You then create a workflow configuration which specifies the specific tags, actions, or all actions that you want to run, and the cadence and timeframes of which you want to run those for. And you select if you want to refresh things, want to have dependents or dependencies included. And that is like a nice, easy way of breaking things apart, scheduling things, and getting multiple different branches and actions of your Dataform model running. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. As always, please like and subscribe to be notified whenever we release new videos. If you've got any suggestions of anything that you'd like us to cover, please give us a shout, and we'll be sure to try and get that in the backlog. Thank you very much.